Welcome everyone to TPN's webinar today. I'm so excited to be in studio with Alison Williams.
Hi, Michelle.
Ellie, you're one of our directors,
Yes.
but you're also a senior intellectual property and commercial attorney, and you specialize in like many things, data protection, schools, credit bureaus,
Yes.
but today we're going to be talking about schools.
Yes.
And specifically we're going to be talking about data protection and this new guide that you and your legal team have created as it relates to data protection POPIA, but more broadly to other pieces of legislation.
Michelle, for months now, we've actually been creating a 30-page document. To say that it's comprehensive is an understatement. What we've done is we've looked at POPIA and we've looked at it in the context of schools specifically in the light of the Constitution, the South African Schools Act and the Children's Act, and we've literally looked at the interplay between all of these pieces of legislation, and we've basically built an intricate puzzle for the schools to help them navigate all of this space.
Fantastic. Before we dive into it, let's go through the housekeeping rules. We've got Peter Menon with us as well. He's our head of legal. Peter will be doing the questions and answers. We're going to hold those over to the last 15 minutes. So do register on your YouTube so that you can access the chat. You can then start greeting us, telling us where you're from. I know we've already got over 50 people registered online and sharing with us who they are and where they're from. But you can ask your questions there. Peter's then going to facilitate those questions to us in the last 15 minutes of the Q&A. I'm guessing it's going to take us around about 30 minutes to get through.
There's a lot of information.
Exactly, these 30 pages. This document, this data protection guide for our schools is available on our POPIA portal. So our schools can, if you're already a POPIA portal member, you can already go and download it. It is there in the policies section. And if you're not yet a member, obviously you can go to popia.tpn.co.za. Peter will post it in the chat now, and you can go and register yourself and download a copy as well. Other housekeeping rules, if we're a little blurry, you simply update the settings. There's a little cog in the bottom right hand corner. Click on settings, click on quality, and then change it to 720p and above, and that'll make us unblurry. And then lastly, we're going to do feedback forms in the last 15 minutes of those Q&A as well. So we do appreciate your feedback. Peter again will post a link in those last 15 minutes. Click the link. You will get a certificate of attendance as a result of submitting your feedback form, and that will give us a lot of information back in terms of how you found the structure of today's session and what you look forward to us presenting in the future. Now, Ellie, data protection,
Yes.
as it relates to schools. I'm going to share one of my most anxious moments ever. Last week, Friday, I had the joy of my child's 9th birthday. So I had 29 and 10-year-olds come to my house from school on the Friday. And in order to get these 20 little people to my house, I had a list, an attendance register of who was coming. I had the au pair's name and telephone number, or the dad's name and telephone number, or the mom's name and telephone number.
Medical information.
I had children that had medication and EpiPens and strict instructions to go straight to hospital if there was an allergic reaction and phone me from the hospital. And I had roll call in front of the car. So who are my 20 little people that I'm taking with? Roll call, are you here? And take a photo of them to post on the group so that the moms know that the kids
You're
are safe.
effectively running a little school.
Right. Thank God not. Very anxious being in control of the health and safety of these 20 little people. And I take my hats off to schools, because schools are in control of hundreds, thousands of these little people on a daily basis.
But fortunately, you wouldn't need to comply with POPIA because
Thank
you did
God.
it for household purposes.
Right.
Unlike you, the school, when they have hundreds of little people, or ranging up until 18, a child is anybody under the age of 18, they do have to comply with this data protection legislation, and it's strict compliance.
So for household purposes, as I was...
You were fine.
I was fine. I didn't need to be POPIA compliant, but our schools do need to be POPIA compliant. And I just want to, before we dive into the actual legislation, I thought it would be a practical moment for us to look at 3 important principles.
The overarching principles.
Right. So let's talk about the definition of children. And for me, I mean, today's announcement by the Department of Health that 12 to 17-year-olds can now choose to get vaccinated themselves children are below the age of 18, and yet in some instances they can make choices for themselves.
And this is a very indicative of the interplay between POPI and the various school-specific legislation. So a child, for general legal purposes, is anybody under the age of 18. But if you look at the Children's Act, any child over the age of 12 is allowed to at least weigh in on any decision that affects them and their mental and physical well-being.
So from a medical perspective, children over the age of 12 have the ability to say, actually, I want to weigh in.
They do, but you also have to look at the age and the level of maturity of the child. Not all 12-year-olds are created equal, so that's an important factor.
I just want to point out that my 10-year-old is 12.
Yes. So you need to take a specific child into consideration.
Right. And then, so we've got this definition of children. And the Act, POPI specifically, the definition of children, there's more comprehensive requirements in terms of how you safeguard and protect the information of children.
Sometimes the Children's Act actually goes way above and beyond POPI, and the POPI says that if any other piece of legislation gives more extensive protection to the privacy of a child or a data subject, you need to give effect to that legislation. And that's why the interplay between all of these pieces of legislation is very important. And Michelle, what we've actually gone and done is we've combed, Amy King, our senior attorney in our legal team, has literally gone and combed and scoured the Children's Act, the Constitution, the South African Schools Act, and she has extracted every single bit of information that deals with personal information and the processing by schools of personal information, not only of children, of all of the stakeholders, the teachers, the parents, the contractors to the school, suppliers, locums, coaches, and she has put this into one 30-page guide and told you as a school what you can and can't do in relation to the processing of personal information, where you need consent, where you don't need consent.
Okay, because that lies us then into consent.
Yes.
Because consent, in some instances, you can process information without consent.
Yes.
In some instances, you can process information with consent. But for children,
so and this is a good example, if you just look at POPI says if you need consent for a child to process personal information, you need consent of a competent person, which is a parent. If you go and look at the Children's Act, however, it takes it so much further. If you need consent for any processing of personal information for a child or anything in relation to a child under any law, you need consent of all of the parents and all of the legal guardians. And in fact, it goes even further, as we've just alluded to. If the child is of an age or maturity or level of development where they can weigh in on any decision that affects them, you need to at least listen to them and give due consideration to their views on that. And again, also, Michelle, the overarching, and if the schools can take anything away from this today, overriding any of this or all of this is the best interests of the child.
And that's the third principle,
That's
Ellie.
embedded in the Constitution.
So let's talk about what this means, this best interests of the children.
So the best interest of the child is in each individual case, when you're processing information as a school, you are entitled, you've got to balance your right to, you have a child has a right to education, a right to dignity, and a right to privacy. You've got to balance all of those rights. And when you're processing information of a child, ask yourself, is it necessary to process this information to provide education? It's not necessary to take pictures of children and put them on Facebook. It's not necessary to post birthday calendars or memes about children or have WhatsApp groups. For all of that, you would need consent of all of the legal guardians. That's not strictly in the provision of education.
And in some instances, you would need consent of the child themselves before you post pictures of them in social media. I know my children, if I take a picture, they say, "Mom, that's not comfortable with that. Please don't disseminate that. Don't share that."
Have those conversations with your children.
That's a private moment. Okay, so Ali, let's go through. In this guide, we've created these 10 instances where in terms of other legislation, the Children's Act, the Schools Act, the Constitution, there is a right in law where the school is obliged to process information, where consent wouldn't be required.
So Michelle, POPI says the general principle is you cannot process personal information of children, bottom line. But then Section 35 of POPI says, okay, we've got this underlying principle, but there are very specific instances where you are permitted to process this information. Consent is one of those, we've discussed it. What is probably the most important exception for schools is you are entitled to process personal information of children if you are giving effect to a legal right or obligation under law. You're trying to exercise, enforce, or defend a legal obligation that the school has under law. And there are 10, we've extracted 10 exceptions where the school is obliged to process this information.
So let's run through those 10, just so that we're setting up our viewers as to where we're going today. So the first would be administration to exams.
Yes. Obviously, you have an obligation as a school to provide an education. You need to be able to assess a child. You can process their personal information to register them for exams. Under a public school and a private school, the South African Schools Act regulates both. We are not going to go into generally specifics as to which applies to which, but the guide has set out very clearly what applies to both public schools and private schools, and where it only applies to one of them.
Okay, and that's in terms of our guide that
That's
we've
in terms of the guide. We've actually extracted and told you where, if you're a private school, this applies to you. If you're a public school, this applies to you.
Perfect. And then, I mean, leading on from your admission to the exam, you've then got the results.
Yes. So you're entitled to record and process your results to assess students. I would caution there, you can actually, it would be sensible if you're publishing it in the newspaper to actually de-identify the child. You don't want to humiliate children who don't have good results. Use a student number or
we know the stress that children go under.
And again, the best interest of the child. That trumps everything. When you're a school, a parent, it doesn't matter who you are. Best interest of the child is the overarching principle.
So Ellie, let's talk about exemptions in terms of school fees. You know, school fee collection is one of the most challenging
especially in times like this.
Right?
So as a public school, if you're a parent and you cannot afford to pay your child's school fees, you are entitled to apply for an exemption of those school fees, and the school is entitled to process your financial information, your salary information in order to assess your application.
Your employment information. So there's certain information in order to process
essential.
That information must be provided
to the school. And I think it's a good juncture at this point to just say, POPIA doesn't stop you doing your business as a school. POPIA is just saying to you, just bear these things in mind. This is important information. You're an ecosystem. You've got a business to run, but just bear these things in mind.
It's about minimality, though, Ellie, as well. So yes, there's a requirement in law in terms of the information we can process from an exemption perspective.
Yes. Don't go and disclose it outside of a group.
But
or the governing body.
Specifically, you're not allowed to disclose it to a third party. But also, this is the information that you may collect. Minimality. Don't collect more than is necessary.
And don't store it for longer than you need it. Destroy it once the application's gone
every
through.
year. You have to make that application every year, right? Okay, so then we've got admissions of handicapped children. Ellie?
That was unusual. We didn't expect this one, but apparently in a private, if you're running a private school and you want to admit a handicapped child, you actually have to ask permission or apply to the head of education. So you're entitled to process that information for that purpose, because they need to come and assess the school to establish whether there are sufficient facilities for a handicapped child.
Right. Let's talk a little bit then about attendance registers. I mean, you've got registers for enrollment, you've got registers for attendance, you've got registers for teachers.
Michelle, I don't know if you ever bunked school as a teenager, but I did. And the school's responsible for the safety and the health of the child. They need to know that the child is there, so obviously they need to have attendance registers and enrollment registers.
And I mean, bunking just leads beautifully into discipline.
Yes. So discipline, again, a huge function of a school. The school is required. They need to be able to process information to deal with suspensions, expulsions, and the general discipline of the child, because that, again, is in the best interest of the child.
But also, Ellie, in terms of the discipline, and our guide goes into detail with this.
Huge detail.
It goes into who may have access to that information.
Again, minimality.
Minimality. Yeah. Who has access to it?
And don't embarrass a child. That's not in the child's best interest.
And I think that, again, which is why we spoke about the overarching principle of what our conversation is around today. So let's then lead into safety.
So safety is a primary responsibility. POPIA actually even deals with this. You're entitled to, as a school, process personal information of a child if it pertains to their health and their sex life, but also initiation. I mean, as parents, one of the biggest fears that we have is the health and well-being of our children and in their peer groups. So the school is entitled to process personal information to deal with initiation practices. In fact, they have a positive obligation to do that. So if there's images on social media about a child being humiliated, we've all seen children being bullied, it's terrible. They are entitled to process that information in order to conduct investigations in the interest of all of the children involved, the instigator and the victim.
I mean, you've led us then into sexual offences, Ellie, and this is a big one.
This is a big one. So the Criminal Laws Amendment Act specifically says that all of us, you, me, all of the people in the audience, schools, all of the stakeholders in school have an obligation to report any sexual misconduct and offence against a child or a mentally handicapped person.
We're going to talk a little bit about the sexual offences register.
Yes, in relation to teachers.
In relation to teachers, and we're going to get into that when we finish this section. We're now on 8, which was sexual offences. We're going to go into number 9, which is the best interests of the child.
So again, the school needs to run a business. So what do we need to do? We need to be able to process information to report an accident, to if a child's had their personal belongings stolen, or if we just want to talk about their medical condition and give them medication in the SAN. So anything that goes to the best interests of the child needs to be able to be processed.
So I know as a parent, I submit a medical form to the school to say this is what my child's allergic to. In the instance that he is hurt or medication needs to be given, what medication can be dispensed to the child at that point in time, what medication would require a phone call to the parents to administer additional medication.
So you raise a good point, Michelle, and I think we're saying to the schools there are instances where you don't need consent, but you need to have conversations with your parents, and your application form when you admit a child is the best place to do this. Tell them what you're going to do with their personal information. Ask them what they want you to do with their child. Get their consent anyway. They can't retract the consent because you have an obligation in law, but at least you eliminate disputes at a later stage and unpleasantness as to what you can and can't do with a child. And you know the best person to tell you what the best interests of a child is the parent. So ask them, get the information up front in the application form. We suggest, actually, if you look at this guide, we love it, we created it, we're a bit proud of it, but it's 30 pages, it's got everything you need. Take the guide and create your own POPIA code of conduct, and then bind all the stakeholders, your parents, your employees, to the code of conduct so that you can exercise disciplinary conduct against teachers if they don't comply, and terminate relationships with parents who don't comply.
Absolutely.
And you deal with everything up front, and everybody, it's all black and white, and everybody knows.
But it's
the
also part of
field.
Elliot, it's also part of an education process.
Yes.
Because as parents, we rely on the school often to know.
Well, huge.
Right? And so we're relying on the school to know what they can do, what they can't do, and often it's in instances of dispute when something's happened.
And it's an emotionally charged situation. It's your child. It's never going to be a rational conversation.
No.
So get it all in writing up front.
Right. And then lastly, we're going to end on the protection of a child.
So,
yes. Ellie, I just want to remind everyone, we're talking about processing of information, where there's a requirement in law to process this information, and we can do so without the consent.
Anything to do with the protection of the child, you would be entitled to process that information. Again, minimal. Don't disclose it to people who don't need to know it. Don't keep it for longer than necessary. But anything to do with the health and well-being of a child, the Constitution is the overarching law of the land. All of this other legislation is promulgated under the banner of the Constitution, and the best interests of the child are paramount.
Right, so for our schools, the takeaway for this summary is, we've got POPIA. It's not there to prevent us from processing information as a business. It's there to allow us to understand what information we're processing it, how we're safeguarding it, how we're retaining it, is it minimal for what we are using it for, and in relation to other pieces of legislation as they apply to our industry, in this case, the Schools Act, the Children's Act. Are there instances when we would be required to process information in terms of these 10?
So Michelle, what we've actually done is done all the work for you. It seems overwhelming, it's actually not. We've got a one-stop shop. What can you do? What can't you do? It's all been done for you, and it's available already.
Perfect.
After this webinar, you can go and download it.
So we've spoken about the children.
Yes.
As you said, though, the school is an ecosystem. So it's not just the children whose information we're processing. Could be the parent.
Could be the parent, but more specifically, it could be the teachers.
Right.
And that, as you say, we've got these children that we love, and we're asking the school to take care of them. We need to know who's going to be taking care of our children. So we need to be able to, and we actually have an obligation in law.
I was going to say there's a requirement in
law. Again,
right?
The Criminal Law Sexual Offences Act, we have an obligation before we employ anyone to ascertain whether they are on the sexual offences register.
And this is because we're dealing with minors, children,
And their health and well-being is everything.
And handicapped children.
Again, but you also can't, that information is confidential. You can't go and publish that information, but you are required to assess that and process the personal information before you admit a teacher onto your board. Again, you also need to process personal information of teachers if you want to employ them. So for the purposes of appointment. Other stakeholders, a school, I mean, how many times have your children left their school kit at home, sport kit, or they're in the wrong uniform? You've got visitors to the school. The school has an obligation to protect the safety and security of the child. We need to know who's coming in at any given point in time. We need their full details. But again, you don't need to go and use those details to direct market and say, come to our open day next Friday, we are a fantastic school. You can't do that. So it's limited.
It's using the information for the purpose that it was collected up front.
Just for security purposes. So that if there's an incident, we know who was at the school at any point in time.
Fantastic. Ellie, we've got into quite a lot of detail in terms of the overarching consent, when required, when not required. In some instances, though, we have children who are over the age of 18. These are adults.
Okay, so now we're into POPIA. We're not into the Children's Act or the Schools Act. And POPIA, again, is a pragmatic act. Section 11 of POPIA says that you can process information of data subject, adults, with consent. So that's one of the principles. But there are other exceptions where you can process the information without consent. So, for example, if you are processing information to perform in terms of a contract to which the data subject is a party, or to protect the legitimate interests of the school or a third party to whom the information is supplied, then you're entitled to process without consent. Generally speaking, you would need to get that information from the data subject themselves, but there are similar exceptions in relation to that principle as well.
Fantastic. Peter, are there any questions that have popped up during the conversation so far?
Michelle, yes, there are. Excuse me. This morning, oh my word. This morning, during the help desk conversations, we also had a number of queries, and I see there was an article on News 24 over the evening as well regarding vaccinations from 12-year-olds to 17-year-olds. Can you please discuss that just in a little bit of a way? Why is that allowed? Why would that be allowed in the case of definitions of children, perhaps, or the child?
So, Peter, as we alluded to earlier on, any child over the age of 12, in terms of the Children's Act, depending on the maturity and level of development of that child, is entitled to at least be heard in relation to any decision that affects their health and well-being. So, as a parent, you are required to have a conversation with your child. If, for example, I know of children that could potentially die if they get this vaccine, as a parent, you would be entitled, your decision could trump your child's view, but unless there's a compelling legal or medical reason, your child's decision and views on the subject should be heard over the age of 12.
And Peter, I do believe that part of that ability to go and get vaccinated as a child, the Department of Health is saying parents should go with the child.
Well, if the child's 18 or 17, you know, that's a different story. But a 12-year-old still growing and still developing. But again, the best interest of the child, how developed is the child, how mature is the child? I mean, if the child's is immature, then you would need to give more guidance.
I think that's such a great stopping point on that question, is best interest of the child always, just like you and Michelle mentioned. Giovanni Redcliffe had an interesting question for us. We have to regularly upload databases from or to the Department of Education and the DDD. If the information is leaked to third parties from DOA institutions, could the school be held liable?
So the school has, the test under POPIA is the school needs to take all reasonable technical and organizational measures to protect the security and integrity of the information. If somebody is processing information on behalf of the school that doesn't come under the direct authority of the school, then they would need to bind that, if it's an obligation in law, then that stands for itself. Otherwise, they need a contract and they need to ensure that they pass those security obligations on to the third party. And if the DOE is responsible, then they would be held liable if there's nothing that the school did wrong.
Thank you very much, Ali. Next question from Adele Leonard. We store our class lists with phone numbers on our computer in the office. Only 2 people have access. Is there a specific way to store or save these documents?
Yes, you should encrypt everything. We're looking, I mean, there's a credit bureau.
I mean, password protection.
General cyber security.
Absolutely, but Ellie, let's go back to the fact that in the health and or the best interest of the child, if something has happened to the child and you need to get hold of a parent in an emergency, the access to the information is important as well. So
everybody who needs to have access should have access.
And
that would be an exception.
Absolutely, but the storage of the data, yes, you absolutely do want to try and ensure that the safety and minimality. So we're storing a number and a person's name as opposed to their banking information. So it depends on the type of information.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We actually got a very interesting one in now from Jackie Brown. What is the obligation for schools who conduct examinations with education boards overseas?
Cross-border data, I love that. But there's an obligation in it.
Yeah, there's an obligation. You either need the consent of the parent to transfer, or parents, or legal guardians to transfer that information overseas, unless you're transferring it to a jurisdiction that has a law in place that protects data protection as much as POPIA does. And there is an exception if they are related companies and they are different branches of the same company.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alison. Just some feedback on one of the polls. 100% of people on the webinar today said that they see that this TPN Schools Data Protection Guide will support their school's compliance journey. So interesting. So I'm sure Amy will be very proud of that and happy about that. There are no further questions in the chat at the moment.
I think if we can just close off then, Ellie, in terms of how schools go and access the POPIA portal, because the POPIA portal is bigger than just the data protection guide. It takes our clients through a personal information impact assessment, which all businesses are required to do.
It's a legal requirement on any information officer.
I see that there were regulations passed recently that now require your POPIA manuals. So every single business now requires a POPIA manuals. Those are included.
So Michelle, I was part of the team that drafted, that helped with the POPIA portal. We drafted, I think, 27 different POPIA compliant policies, including the POPIA manual that you need. Anything and everything that you need in relation to POPIA is literally in POPIA portal. Your work away from home policies,
bring your own device to
bring your
work.
own, exactly. Everything is in there. We've spent we've done everything for you. It's literally just there.
Excellent. So folks, if you need to go over to our POPIA portal, it's poppy.tpn.co.za, and I know the team will post it both in the link and again up on the screen. The feedback forms have been posted as well, so please do complete the feedback forms for us. That'll allow us to ensure that future seminars that we create, future webinars that we create, will be able to address the questions that you pose to us in that feedback as well.
Yeah, we want to ensure it's relevant for you.
Absolutely. I think we can close off on that. And for me, the takeaway, and it really is, what are we doing for the best interest of our children?
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.